Before the light ever touches the trees, and long before anything you could call morning, there is a whistle. It cuts through the mountain fog the way the cold does, moving not around you, but straight through you. Somewhere in that dark, on bare wood floors tucked into the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Georgia, boys as young as 8 years old are already on their feet. The place has a name that sounds like mercy, the Blue Ridge Industrial Home for Boys, which sounds like a school or a place of salvation. The reality was that the logs these children were about to carry often weighed more than they did. What we have to figure out is who actually built this place, who was getting rich off the work, and what happened to the boys who walked through that gate and never walked back out. There is a kind of silence that only those who have been to the North Georgia mountains truly know. It is not the tranquil silence of a Sunday afternoon, but another kind that feels dense, alive, and layered. The wind that comes off those ridges carries something that doesn't have a clean name, and the mountains themselves, the old Blue Ridge running through Fannin and Union counties, have a very particular way of keeping what happens inside them. That silence mattered a great deal between 1910 and 1915 because a lot was happening inside those woods. The timber industry had been tearing through Appalachian Georgia since the railroads arrived in the 1880s, and by the early 1900s, the slopes were being stripped at a pace the land simply could not recover from. Lumber companies needed workers who were cheap, available, and unlikely to complain to anyone who could actually do something about it. While the mountains provided the timber, the county poor farms and orphan courts provided the labor. To understand this era, you have to realize that there was no federal child labor law until 1938. Georgia had state statutes on paper, but enforcement in rural mountain counties was a courtesy, at best. The men who ran the mills and the camps and the county offices were often the same people, or they at least knew each other by name and attended the same churches. Outside law moved slow in the high country, but local power moved very fast. Into that gap, a specific type of institution began to grow. They were called charity homes, industrial schools, or Christian refuges, and the names shifted depending on who was being asked for money. What they all had in common was that almost none of them were subject to any kind of meaningful inspection. A man with a church letter and a few recommendations from the right people could open a home on a tract of land and start receiving county funds within a few months. The paperwork looked fine and the mission statements were moving, but nobody was required to check whether the reality matched the words. A boy without parents in this world had no one to ask questions on his behalf, and there was no one to notice if his letters stopped coming. No one was going to show up at the gate and demand to see him because the county had transferred guardianship to the institution, and the institution answered to almost no one. That was not an accident, it was a condition, and certain men in certain counties understood exactly what that condition made possible. Into this world, one man arrived with a plan dressed up as philanthropy. He didn't arrive looking like a predator, and that is the first thing you have to understand about how this started. He arrived looking like a solution to a problem everyone wanted solved. The man who built the Blue Ridge Industrial Home for Boys showed up using the vocabulary of a reformer, speaking often about boys who were adrift or lacked a moral anchor. He promised these children needed the discipline of honest work and the steady hand of Christian principles to grow into useful men, which was a message that landed perfectly in county offices and church halls. It was exactly what the men in those parlors wanted to hear, because it offered the idea of doing good without requiring them to get their own hands dirty in the process. He was articulate and stayed appropriately humble, always making sure he had the right references to back up his claims. The industrial education model he used as his template wasn't something he invented himself, but rather a system seen all across the country at the time. Institutions running on the Booker T. Washington framework had made the idea of mixing school with trade work seem respectable and even progressive to the public eye. When people heard about boys learning carpentry, farming, or basic mechanics, they saw it as a legitimate path forward that state legislatures liked and philanthropists were happy to fund. Because there were enough genuine success stories scattered around the nation, a man proposing a similar home in a remote Georgia county sounded completely credible before anyone thought to look closer. On paper, his proposal described a home where orphaned and struggling boys would spend their mornings in a classroom and their afternoons learning a trade. He secured land in the timber country of the North Georgia highlands and framed the location as a benefit, claiming the fresh mountain air and distance from the city would protect the boys from corruption. The county agreed to the plan, and the church board signed off on it, while a group of local businessmen provided the initial funds. At least 2 county officials even wrote letters of support that helped him secure legal custody of children through the state's orphan court system. The supply of boys for the home came from 3 different directions to keep the beds full. County poor farms were happy to pass along children so they didn't have to pay for their housing, and orphan courts transferred boys whose only real crime was having no family left to care for them. Some families were so desperate that they actually believed the printed mission statement and handed over their own sons voluntarily, fully trusting that the home would provide the future it promised. The paperwork looked clean and the mission statement was moving, but the timber contracts he signed during that first year of operation never appeared in the documents he showed his donors. That is where the gap lives, right between the public ledger and the one he kept for himself. There was a massive difference between the letters sent to the county board describing a school and the lumber company invoices showing his operation was selling hundreds of board feet of cut timber. While the official enrollment register listed these children as students, the neighboring sawmill accounts recorded them as nothing more than day labor. A few people did notice that things weren't right, including some workers who passed through and decided never to come back. One neighboring farmer mentioned to someone that the boys he saw on the road looked wrong, noting they were far too thin and moved with a slowness that didn't fit their age. But noticing a problem and knowing how to fix it are 2 very different things, and in that part of Georgia back then, the distance between those 2 points was wide. The first warnings never traveled very far from the mountain. The people who were in the best position to do something were, in many cases, the same people whose signatures were already sitting on the founding documents. The boys arrived at the gates having no idea what they were walking into. They came to the mountains expecting a school, and many of them had been promised classrooms, warm meals, and a real bed. Some of the boys were told almost nothing at all, only that they were going somewhere better than the place they were leaving behind. A few even arrived holding the printed pamphlet the home sent to county officials, which was filled with talk about Christian education and building character through honest work. The bunkhouse didn't have any pamphlets in it, but it did have plank floors, shared blankets, and a smell that never seemed to leave your clothes. It was a thick scent of sawdust and damp wool with something sour underneath it that stayed in your nose. The boys who arrived first had to learn the routine fast, mostly because the boys who had been there longer weren't interested in explaining things gently. You woke up the second the whistle blew, before the sun was even over the ridge, and you moved because there was no such thing as easing into the day. What the home passed off as breakfast was so thin that some boys later said eating it felt more like a ritual than an actual meal. It was just something to stand around and hold in your hands, but it never did anything to take away the constant hunger. After that came the long walk to the timber site, which for some was more than a mile through the mountain weather in whatever shoes they happened to own. You have to understand the work in physical terms, because it is easy to hear the word logging and not realize what that meant for a child's body. A crosscut saw takes 2 people to operate and creates a deep resistance that you feel in your shoulders for the rest of your life. Hauling cut logs down a steep slope with a PV hook requires a kind of leverage that takes a grown man years to master. These logs weighed hundreds of pounds, and if one shifted the wrong way, there was no margin for error. Experienced men lost fingers and feet in timber operations all over Appalachia during those years, so boys who had no training and no body mass had no business being near that wood. But they were out there 6 days a week, starting their work before the sun came up and staying until the light was completely gone. Whatever classroom was supposed to exist at the home wasn't something the boys could describe later with any detail, because they were rarely allowed inside it. Some remembered a single room with a few benches that always smelled like they hadn't been used in months. One boy mentioned seeing a Bible left on a shelf, but the record doesn't show any evidence that formal instruction ever actually happened. The total lack of academic records, enrollment sheets, or teaching materials suggests the school was nothing more than a front for the labor. The discipline at the home was both straightforward and incredibly brutal. If a boy slowed down on the job, he was reported to the supervisor, and the consequences were waiting for him when he got back that evening. Being locked in a cold outbuilding was a common punishment, as were the beatings that happened for even the smallest mistakes. Sometimes they would refuse to give a boy his evening meal, which meant a child who was already exhausted from 12 hours of labor had to go to sleep on an empty stomach. The reason they gave for this was that weakness was a moral failure that had to be beaten out of them. When boys tried to run away, they were almost always brought back to the mountain. Sometimes the men employed by the home would hunt them down, and other times the local sheriffs would return them because they saw the legal paperwork and thought they were doing the right thing. A few boys actually made it to the nearest town, but the first adults they met usually just turned them over and sent them right back to the operator. The youngest children, some only 6 or 7 years old, were too small to handle the heavy timber work in the woods. They were kept at the main facility to perform what investigators later called domestic labor, which meant hauling heavy water buckets and splitting kindling all day. They spent their time cleaning the operator's quarters or tending to the livestock, and this was the closest thing to light duty the home ever offered. There were no visiting days for families, and every letter sent or received was handled by the administration first. The mountains have a way of absorbing sound, just like they absorb everything else, and for a long time, they didn't let a single word of this escape to the outside world. For years, that silence was the only thing that held. The silence broke the way it usually does in places like this, not with a dramatic confession or a body found in plain sight, but with a single account that reached the wrong person. From the operator's point of view, it was the worst person possible. The story that finally reached investigators came from a boy who had made it out, though not through some daring escape or a clever plan. He simply turned 16, which according to the home's own paperwork marked the end of his time there, so they opened the gates and let him go. He walked out through the same entrance he'd entered years before, looking thinner and carrying a scar on his forearm that hadn't been there when he arrived. He had no reading or math skills to show for his time, but he did have his memory, and he eventually found someone who was willing to write it all down. That someone happened to be a county official in a neighboring jurisdiction, which is a detail that actually matters quite a bit. The man who listened to the boy had no prior relationship with the institution, hadn't signed any of its founding documents, and didn't owe any loyalty to the men who ran the place. He forwarded the report to the state's Child Welfare Board, which in 1910s Georgia was a small and underfunded office with very little authority, but it did at least have a functioning postal address. The Welfare Board's initial response was cautious, which is really just a polite way of saying they were slow to act. It was the kind of institutional hesitation that comes from knowing how often these complaints disappear once the right people make a few phone calls. A letter went out to the home's operator asking for a response to the claims, and he replied quickly in very careful language. He described the boy as a troubled and ungrateful child whose story was based on personal resentment rather than the truth. To back this up, he included 2 letters from local ministers who praised his character and a financial summary he'd written himself that showed how much the home spent on food. The welfare board accepted his word and closed the inquiry without looking further. But the boy had also spoken to someone else, a journalist for a small regional paper who had heard the story secondhand through that same county official's office. Unlike the state board, she wasn't bound by institutional caution or political ties, so she started asking questions in the county where the home operated. She moved carefully because she understood the local dynamics, and when she finally drove up that long road, she didn't find anything that matched the printed mission statement. She noticed there wasn't any visible classroom space being used for lessons, and instead, she saw a massive timber operation running on the property and the land next to it. She watched the boys moving through the site and noted their age, their physical condition, and the sheer weight of the loads they were forced to carry. When she requested an interview, the operator declined twice before finally agreeing to a short talk on the porch of the main building. He offered her coffee and explained that the home was thriving because the boys were finally learning the true dignity of hard labor. She published her piece shortly after that, though it wasn't a very long article because her editor was worried about a libel claim from a man with such high local standing. What actually ran was careful and hedged, but it was specific enough to name the institution and describe what the reporter had seen with her own eyes. It publicly asked why a home receiving county funds for education didn't seem to have a single verifiable academic program for the children. The operator's response was immediate and loud, and he wrote a letter to the paper calling the reporting reckless and the work of outside agitators. He claimed these outsiders simply didn't understand the mountain traditions of practical education, and several local businessmen even signed a letter to support him. The county board followed suit by issuing a statement expressing their full confidence in how the home was being managed. The boys were never consulted during any of this, but as it turned out, the official record was going to be much harder to dismiss than the boys were. The paper trail didn't just appear out of thin air, and it had to be pulled apart from 3 different filing systems across the state. Investigators had to dig through county courthouse records, the state welfare board's archives, and timber company ledgers that had been turned over during a completely unrelated business dispute. That last source was where the numbers started to tell a story that was impossible to explain away. The lumber company that held the main contract with the home had recorded every single transaction in their own bookkeeping as a matter of routine. They tracked the timber volume they received, the delivery dates, and exactly how much they paid the operator for the wood. When investigators compared those figures against what the operator had reported to the county board as his annual costs, the gap was massive. The revenue from the logging operation was worth hundreds of dollars every year, which was a fortune in rural Georgia in 1915, yet none of that money appeared in the official accounts. The home's ledger showed expenses for food and clothing, while the timber contracts showed a profitable business, meaning the 2 sets of books described 2 completely different worlds. The injury records told a different and much darker story, though the home didn't bother to keep a consistent log of medical problems. What they did have were scattered entries for a boy treated for a hand wound, or another who had suffered what was simply recorded as a fall. These entries were almost always incomplete or undated, and in several cases, they didn't list what happened to the boy afterward. Whether those children recovered, were sent away, or just stopped being accounted for, is something we will never know from the records that survived. Investigators noted that this lack of information was a finding in itself, because a real institution would have kept better track of the children in its care. The gaps weren't an accident, as incomplete paperwork is much easier to defend than a document that says something specific and damning. Testimony from people who had been there started to fill in the holes that the paper trail left wide open. Former workers who had been hired as drivers or supervisors gave accounts to investigators that matched exactly what the escaped boy had described. One former employee confirmed that boys were regularly taken to neighboring sawmills and hired out as extra labor, with all the payments going directly to the operator. Another man described the punishment building and confirmed it was used all the time to keep the boys in line. A woman who lived just a quarter-mile away told investigators she had spent 3 years watching children move timber loads that were too heavy for grown men to handle. None of these witnesses had come forward before the journalist's piece was published, but it wasn't because they hadn't seen the abuse. They stayed silent because there was nowhere to take the information, and they had no reason to believe anyone in a position of power would actually listen. This pattern wasn't just happening in this one county, and across Georgia and the rest of the South, similar operations were attracting the same kinds of complaints. These were industrial schools and charity homes where the education was a total lie and the labor was the only thing that was real. County funds were being used to subsidize what were essentially private timber or farming businesses, and the boys involved were legally invisible. A state report from 1913 had mentioned the problem in general terms, but it didn't name any names and only recommended more scrutiny for homes that took public money. That recommendation didn't have any teeth, so it just sat in a file and did nothing to help the children. What made this specific case stand out wasn't the size of the operation, as there were much larger homes with longer histories of documented abuse in other states. What caught the eye of the investigators was the sheer precision of the financial exploitation and how carefully it had been planned. Most people running these kinds of schemes were sloppy, but this operator had been systematic and patient from the very start. He had built up his credibility over years, kept the right people happy, and made sure the most incriminating records stayed in the timber company's files instead of his own. He understood that the best way to keep the money flowing was to make sure no single document ever told the whole story. The question was no longer whether something terrible had happened at the home. The only question left was whether anyone was actually going to be held responsible for it. The investigation finally produced a report, and it was a heavy thing. It held names, specific figures, and testimony that all pointed toward a single, ugly truth about what was happening to the boys inside that home. If the world worked the way we like to think it does, that document would have been more than enough to bring the whole thing crashing down. But it wasn't enough, and to understand why, you have to look past the details of the crimes and see the shape of the power behind them. The man running the home hadn't just built a business, he had built a fortress of social standing. Over the years, he'd gathered the kind of local credibility that works like a suit of armor in a small town. He was a deacon in his church, a regular contributor to the county fair, and a man who appeared in photographs alongside the very people whose names were carved into the courthouse walls. When that report landed on the prosecutor's desk, the phones didn't ring with angry citizens demanding justice. Instead, the calls came from the operator's friends, men who had signed his original letters of recommendation or directed county tax dollars into his pockets, and they all had a very personal reason to hope the investigation stayed quiet. This is how a system protects its own, and it rarely happens with a single, dramatic demand to drop a case. It happens through a dozen quiet conversations over coffee or on a porch, or someone mentions government overreach, or questions if a witness is really reliable. These small nudges slowly change the boundaries of what is possible until the truth is squeezed out of the room without anyone ever having to leave a paper trail of their interference. The officials who had originally certified the home found themselves in a desperate bind of their own making. If they allowed a full prosecution based on these findings, they were essentially admitting to the world that their own oversight had been a total failure. Some of these men had walked the grounds themselves and walked away satisfied, which meant their previous approval was now evidence of either their own incompetence or their complicity. For many of them, the urge to bury the findings wasn't even about being a villain. It was just that believing the operator's lies was much easier than looking in the mirror. For the boys who stood up to testify, the reality was much colder and more dangerous. In Georgia during the early 1900s, a child who was a ward of the state had almost no legal standing at all. The prosecutor's office treated their stories as something extra rather than the heart of the case, calling them useful for texture but unreliable as actual evidence. When one 14-year-old boy gave a detailed account of the abuse, the operator's lawyer publicly labeled him a chronic liar and a runaway. That characterization was printed in the county newspaper the very next week, and the editors didn't bother to ask the boy or anyone who knew him for a response. He was just a child with no family and no lawyer, sitting in a room full of powerful men in suits, watching the machinery of the law slow down until it simply stopped. Eventually, some charges were filed, but they were weak and narrow compared to the mountain of evidence the investigators had gathered. The case dragged through the courts at a crawl, and by the time a hearing actually happened, many of the key witnesses had moved away or disappeared. One former employee who had promised to talk could no longer be found when the subpoenas went out, and the record doesn't say if he left on his own or if someone paid him to vanish. This wasn't an isolated incident, as other Georgia institutions under investigation at the time followed the exact same path toward nothing. You see the same pattern over and over. An investigation finds horror, a prosecution brings minor charges, and the whole thing ends in a small fine or a slap on the wrist. It happens so often across so many counties that it suggests the legal architecture of the time was never meant to hold a man of standing accountable for what he did to children who had no standing at all. Some of those boys eventually grew up and walked away, but many others just faded out of the record entirely. Most stories like this end with a verdict or a closing statement, but this one ends with a ledger that just stops in the middle of a page. When researchers started comparing the home's enrollment lists against state census data and death registers from the 1920s, they found a pattern that has no clean explanation. You can find a boy's name and age in the intake records, seeing exactly which county poor farm or orphan court sent him there. And then he just vanishes. There is no record of him being discharged, no death certificate filed in his name, and no mention of him in later census records as a laborer or a resident anywhere else. He arrives in the paperwork, and then the paperwork ends, leaving you to wonder if the boy's life ended right along with it. Now, this didn't happen to every child, as some boys can be traced through the years as they moved to other counties and tried to rebuild their lives. The fact that we can find some of them actually makes the missing ones more haunting, because it proves the records were real, and these weren't just made-up names on a page. It makes it impossible to dismiss the gaps as a simple mistake by a tired clerk. The trouble with finding the truth about these children is that the system was designed to lose them. Back then, the records of who was coming and going were held by the institutions themselves, and there was no state agency double-checking the math. Once a county court signed a child over to a place like this, they washed their hands of him completely. Whether that boy thrived or died was left entirely up to the institution to record, and if they chose to stay silent, there was no one to speak for him. And then the mountains did the rest of the work. Logging operations changed the very shape of the earth in ways that can't be undone. The land where the home sat, along with the thousands of acres they leased for timber work, was chewed up for years as slopes were cleared and the soil was packed down by massive loads of wood. In those days, the North Georgia highlands weren't surveyed with any real precision, so there were no maps or marked paths to follow. If there were informal burials or accidents deep in the woods, the shifting earth and the growing forest would have swallowed them up long ago. We can only speculate about what lies under the dirt, but the land itself isn't talking. It is hard to say exactly how many children were lost, but the fragments of records we have suggest between 60 and 90 boys lived there over the years. Out of that group, less than half can be found in any records after they left the home. The rest are just a hole in history, not a confirmed death toll perhaps, but certainly not an absence that feels innocent. When an institution is doing what it's supposed to do, it leaves a trail of paper, and when boys leave a place in good standing, they usually show up somewhere else. The fact that both the paper and the people are missing isn't a coincidence. The investigators at the time saw this gap, and they knew what it meant, even if they couldn't prove it. Their report used very careful, clinical language, calling the boys unaccounted for, and the records insufficient. That phrasing was technically accurate, but it was also devastating because it described a world where the people in charge had made sure the truth could never be confirmed or denied. In a story like this, the absence of a record is a finding all on its own. The home did eventually close its doors for good, but you shouldn't mistake that for justice. The home closed exactly the way it had opened, quietly, through paperwork, and without any ceremony at all. There was no dramatic raid by the authorities, no marshal placing a heavy padlock on the front gate, and no public announcement that something terrible had been stopped. Instead, the county simply withdrew its funding during a routine budget review. They used the phrase administrative irregularities to explain the decision, which is the kind of language that could mean almost anything, and was likely chosen for that exact reason. The State Welfare Board updated its records to show the institution was now inactive, and the boys who were still living there were sent off to other county facilities. The operator simply walked away. He never saw the inside of a prison cell. The charges against him had been whittled down during the legal process, and the whole thing ended with a fine. If you look at the records today, the exact amount of that fine changes depending on which county court you check. There were proceedings in 2 separate jurisdictions, and neither one managed to produce a clean final entry. What we do know is that he paid some money, though not a very large amount, and the court treated that payment as the end of the matter. There was no conviction to follow him on paper, and no legal bar to keep him from opening a similar home in the future. Within a few years, he moved away, and the record doesn't tell us if he tried the same thing somewhere else. He had a habit of using slightly different names for his organizations, and by the time anyone might have thought to check on him, the people in charge had already moved on to other things. The land eventually went back to what it was before. Some of the parcels were sold off to timber companies, which feels like a cruel irony when you consider what those boys were forced to do on that soil. Other pieces of the property passed through different owners over the decades, following the same pattern you see all over rural Georgia. The land is farmed for a while, then it gets logged, then it's left alone until the scrub brush and the pines take it back. There is no marker on the property to tell you what happened there, and you won't find a historical note on any county map. The site of the home has been swallowed by the terrain, and today, the woods give no indication that anything ever happened. Georgia's official response to the investigation was small. In 1917, a committee report suggested that the state should inspect any institution receiving public money more often. Those ideas eventually helped shape a 1921 law that slightly increased the reporting requirements for private charity homes. However, that law didn't apply to anything that had happened in the past, and it didn't create an investigative office with any real power to change things. It was progress in the same way that nailing a single board over a hole in a fence is progress. It was technically an improvement, but in practice, it wasn't nearly enough to fix the problem. The federal government moved even slower toward a real solution. The Keating-Owen Child Labor Act was passed in 1916, but the Supreme Court struck it down only 2 years later. It wasn't until 1938, when the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed, that federal protections for children finally had some teeth. By the time that happened, the boys who had been forced to work the Blue Ridge timberlines were men in their 30s or 40s, assuming they were still alive at all. There is a specific kind of cruelty in institutions that hide behind the language of charity. They leave a different kind of wreckage than a business that is just out for profit. It is easy to look back and see a factory owner who used child labor as a villain, but this was different. This was a man who framed his work as a Christian mission, who had ministers willing to vouch for his character, and who called the boys in his care beneficiaries instead of workers. That language makes his record murkier and makes it much harder to hold him accountable in a way that feels like justice. The words of charity acted like a sponge that soaked up the damage. They made the wrong thing harder to name, harder to prosecute, and in the end, much easier for the world to forget. Stories usually survive because someone with power had a reason to keep them alive. Maybe there was a trial that ended in a famous conviction, or a victim whose name was eventually attached to a new law. Sometimes the villain is theatrical enough to become a symbol that people use as a warning. This case didn't have any of those things. All it had was a small fine, a quiet administrative closure, and a group of boys who were scattered across a state that had already stopped keeping track of them. That isn't unusual for Appalachian history, and it certainly isn't an accident. For most of the 19th and early 20th centuries, this region was systematically underdocumented. It wasn't exactly neglect, but rather a deliberate lack of interest from the institutions that usually keep official records. State and federal governments didn't pay much attention to rural mountain counties, and the local newspapers mostly served local interests. The people who were most likely to write things down were often the same people who had very good reasons to keep certain things off the record. Because of that, entire categories of life just disappeared. What happened inside a specific home, who worked a certain timber claim, or which boys were present in a given year, are all just gaps in archives that were never complete to begin with. The boys themselves left almost nothing behind in writing. Many of them were far too young to write well, and those who could weren't given the paper or the time to do it. The institution controlled everything that went through the gate, including the mail, and any letters sent out were almost certainly read by the staff first. Whatever those boys were feeling, and whether they knew what was happening was wrong or had been told it was right, stayed locked inside them. Most of them took those secrets with them when they finally left the home, or when they passed away. Trying to recover a story like this requires a very specific kind of stubbornness. You have to be willing to sit in a cold county courthouse basement and look at microfilm that hasn't been touched in 40 years. You have to spend hours checking census rolls against intake records and timber company ledgers, knowing the whole time that the information will be incomplete. You have to accept that incomplete is still better than nothing at all. Often, it means finding the one local historian who spent 10 years researching something that nobody asked them to look into, simply because they grew up near the land and could feel the weight of what wasn't being said. The pattern behind all of this is very old and very consistent. Whenever people who have no one to speak for them are exploited, the record starts to thin out. It doesn't happen because no one was watching. It happens because the people who were watching had reasons to look away, and the system around them made looking away the easiest thing to do. This story isn't an outlier or a strange exception. It is a type of story that has happened many times before. And these patterns will continue to repeat themselves until someone finally stands up and gives them a name. Deep in the North Georgia highlands, on land that has been logged and sold and reclaimed by the brush, you won't find a single marker or stone to tell you what the ground once knew. Those boys walked straight into the fog, and the mountains took their secret and held onto it for over 100 years. The only reason we are even talking about this today is because someone finally decided to go looking for the truth. Make sure to subscribe if you want to hear more stories that never made it into the history books, and share this one with someone you think needs to hear it.